What happens when a routine suburban power trip collides with the highest levels of the federal government? It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday afternoon, but when two officers decided to handcuff a black woman for disorderly conduct, they had no idea they just arrested their boss's boss. Sarah Jenkins was not having a glamorous Sunday. At 42, she was usually draped in a tailored charcoal blazer, power walking through the marble corridors of the Robert F. Kennedy Department of Justice building in Washington, D.C. As a senior litigator in the Civil Rights Division, her weekdays were a blur of federal injunctions, grand jury subpoenas, and dismantling systemic constitutional violations. She was brilliant, relentless, and arguably one of the most formidable attorneys on the East Coast. But today, Sarah was off the clock. She wore a faded Georgetown law hoodie, a pair of worn-in yoga pants, and mud-scuffed sneakers. She was standing in the driveway of a stunning two-story colonial home in Alexandria, Virginia. The neighborhood, Oakbrook Estates, was a manicured enclave of wealth, characterized by perfectly trimmed hedges, sprawling oak trees, and neighbors who knew everyone's business. Sarah had just closed on the property 3 days prior. It was her dream home, a quiet sanctuary away from the brutal, high-stakes environment of federal court. She was waiting for her contractor, a man named David, to arrive and give her a quote on renovating the wraparound porch. Because the house was still entirely empty and she hadn't fully moved in, Sarah was walking the perimeter, taking measurements with a yellow tape measure, occasionally jotting down numbers in a small leather notebook. Across the street, the curtains of a bay window twitched. Brenda Carmichael, a retired real estate agent who had appointed herself the unofficial captain of the neighborhood watch, was peering through the blinds. Brenda didn't recognize the woman pacing around the old Whitman property. The Whitmans had moved out weeks ago, and to Brenda's knowledge, the house was vacant. What Brenda saw was a black woman in sweatpants walking around a $1 million property, looking into the ground floor windows. Instead of walking across the street to introduce herself, or simply minding her own business, Brenda picked up her phone and dialed the local police precinct's non-emergency line. She reported a suspicious individual casing a vacant home, adding that the person was prowling and acting defensively. 10 minutes later, the quiet autumn air was shattered by the crunch of heavy tires on gravel. A black and white Alexandria police cruiser pulled up squarely, blocking Sarah's silver sedan, which was parked legally on the street. Sarah looked up from her notebook. She watched as two officers stepped out of the vehicle. Officer Thomas Barrett was in his late 20s, a man whose posture radiated a desperate need for authority. His partner, Officer Kevin Miller, was older, looking slightly bored as he adjusted his duty belt. Afternoon, Officer Barrett called out his hand, resting casually but intentionally near his sidearm. He closed the distance between the cruiser and the driveway, stepping onto Sarah's property without hesitation. "Good afternoon, officers," Sarah replied, keeping her voice even and polite. She let the tape measure retract with a sharp snap. "Can I help you? We got a call about a suspicious person trespassing on this property," Barrett said, stopping about 4 feet away from her. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her faded hoodie. "What's your business here?" "I'm the homeowner," Sarah said simply. "I just closed on the house on Thursday. I'm waiting for my contractor." Barrett exchanged a glance with Miller. It was a look Sarah had seen 1,000 times in her career, a smirk of profound disbelief masquerading as procedural skepticism. "The homeowner," Barrett repeated slowly. "You bought this place." "I did," Sarah affirmed. She didn't offer a smile. She knew exactly where this was going, and as a constitutional lawyer, her internal radar was already pinging. "All right, well, if you're the homeowner, you won't mind showing us some identification," Barrett said, holding out a gloved hand. Sarah sighed softly. "My ID is inside my purse, which is locked inside my car." She pointed to the silver sedan parked on the street. "But frankly, officer, unless you suspect me of committing a crime, I have no legal obligation to provide you with identification on my own private property." Officer Barrett's jaw tightened. The casual demeanor evaporated, replaced by a rigid, defensive posture. Mom, we're investigating a report of a burglary in progress. That gives me the right to identify you. Now go to your car and get your ID, a burglary in progress. Sarah raised an eyebrow, her litigator instinct taking the wheel. I'm standing in broad daylight, holding a tape measure and a notebook. I am not attempting to enter the house forcefully. Under Terry versus Ohio, you need reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime is afoot to detain and demand identification. An anonymous phone call from a neighbor who doesn't recognize me doesn't meet that threshold. Officer Miller, the older partner, blinked. He wasn't used to citizens citing Supreme Court case law with the crisp, effortless diction of a law professor. He took a half step forward, trying to de-escalate. Look, Mom, we're just doing our jobs. A neighbor called it in. If you just show us your ID, we can clear this up and get out of your hair. Officer, Sarah said, turning her sharp gaze to Miller. I appreciate that you are responding to a dispatch, but I am telling you, as a matter of law, that I am on my own property, and I am not legally required to produce papers simply because a neighbor made an unfounded assumption based on my appearance. Barrett stepped closer, closing the gap to an uncomfortably intimate distance. Listen to me very carefully. I don't care what you think you know about the law. You are being uncooperative. You are causing a disturbance now. You are going to get your ID, or I am going to detain you. Sarah didn't flinch. She looked Barrett directly in the eyes. Are you giving me a lawful order? Officer, I am. And if I refuse an unlawful search, you plan to arrest me. I will arrest you for disorderly conduct and obstructing an investigation. Barrett snapped his face, flushing red. Sarah's mind worked at lightning speed. She could easily walk to the car, grab her driver's license, and end this. She could even pull out her gold-embossed Department of Justice badge, flash it in his face, and watch the color drain from his cheeks. But a darker, more righteous anger was brewing in her chest. How many people she thought didn't have a DOJ badge? How many kids from her old neighborhood in Baltimore had been backed against a wall by a cop like Barrett, intimidated into giving up their Fourth Amendment rights just to avoid a pair of handcuffs? She made a decision. She wasn't just Sarah Jenkins, homeowner right now. She was Sarah Jenkins' civil rights watchdog, and she was going to let Officer Thomas Barrett dig his own grave. I decline your request, Sarah said calmly. I am not providing identification. If you feel you have probable cause to arrest me, you may proceed. Otherwise, I would like you to step off my property. For a grueling 3 seconds, nobody moved. The autumn breeze rustled the oak leaves above them. Across the street, Brenda Carmichael had stepped fully out onto her front porch, her arms crossed, watching the spectacle with a look of grim satisfaction. Officer Barrett let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. All right, have it your way. Before Officer Miller could intervene, Barrett lunged forward. He grabbed Sarah's left wrist, twisting it sharply behind her back. Sarah gasped, more from the shock of the physical contact than the pain. You are touching me without my consent. You are initiating a false arrest, she stated clearly, her voice loud enough for the neighborhood to hear, but entirely devoid of panic. Stop resisting, Barrett barked, pushing her slightly forward against the hood of her own car. I am completely compliant, Sarah replied, keeping her body entirely limp and relaxed. I am not pulling away. I am not raising my voice. Please note for your body camera that I am perfectly still. Miller hurried over, looking incredibly anxious. Tom, hey, let's just cuff her, Kevin, Barrett ordered, his adrenaline clearly spiking. She's refusing to identify. She's obstructing. Give me your cuffs. Miller hesitated, but the ingrained brotherhood of the badge took over. He unclipped the steel handcuffs from his belt and handed them over. Click, click. The cold metal clamped down on Sarah's wrists. The reality of the situation washed over her. She was a senior federal prosecutor. She had personally drafted consent decrees that overhauled entire corrupt police departments. She had argued before federal appellate judges, and now she was being handcuffed against the hood of a sedan in her own driveway because she refused to bow to a bruised ego. "You are under arrest for disorderly conduct and obstruction of justice," Barrett recited, his voice dripping with triumphant authority. He patted down her pockets, finding nothing but her car keys, which he tossed onto the hood of the car. "Officer Barrett," Sarah said, reading his name tag. "And Officer Miller, I want to be very clear. I am memorizing your badge numbers. I am asserting my right to remain silent, and I will not answer any further questions without an attorney present." "You're going to need one," Barrett sneered. He grabbed her by the bicep, guiding her forcefully toward the back of the cruiser. As they walked down the driveway, Sarah kept her head held high. She saw Brenda Carmichael watching from the opposite sidewalk, looking utterly vindicated. Several other neighbors had stepped out of their houses to watch the commotion. It was the ultimate suburban nightmare, being paraded in handcuffs in front of the people you were supposed to live next to for the next 20 years. But Sarah didn't feel humiliation. She felt absolute ice-cold clarity. Barrett pushed her down into the back of the cruiser. The plastic seat was hard and uncomfortable. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing her in the claustrophobic, cage-like back seat. Through the plexiglass divider, she watched Barrett and Miller climb into the front. "Unbelievable," Barrett muttered, starting the engine. "These people think they can read one article online and suddenly they're legal scholars." "I don't know, man," Miller said quietly, adjusting the rearview mirror to glance back at Sarah. "She didn't seem crazy. Maybe she really did buy the house." "Then she should have showed her ID like a normal person," Barrett retorted, putting the car in drive. "You don't get to mouth off to a badge and walk away. She's going to spend a few hours in holding, and maybe she'll learn some respect." The drive to the precinct took 20 minutes. Sarah sat in silence, staring out the window as the scenic suburban streets gave way to the concrete and glass of the municipal district. She was mentally drafting the title 42 Section 1983 Civil Rights Lawsuit. She was outlining the excessive force complaint. She was already anticipating the moment she would depose Officer Barrett under oath. She wasn't just going to sue him. She was going to make an example out of him. The cruiser pulled into the secure sally port of the Alexandria Police Department. The heavy garage doors rolled down behind them. Barrett opened the back door and pulled Sarah out by the arm, marching her through the double doors into the booking area. The precinct was bustling. Phones were ringing. Officers were typing away at heavy keyboards, and the smell of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner hung in the air. At the elevated front desk sat Sergeant Richard Hayes, a 20-year veteran of the force with graying hair and a tired expression. He looked down from his computer monitor as Barrett marched Sarah to the booking counter. "What do we have, Barrett?" Sergeant Hayes asked, stifling a yawn. "Refusal to identify, obstruction, and disorderly conduct," Sarge Barrett said proudly. "Got a call about a prowler in Oak Brook Estates. Found her case in the old Whitman place. Refused to provide ID. Started getting combative and quoting fake law." Sergeant Hayes looked at Sarah. He noted the Georgetown law hoodie, the calm posture, and the fact that she wasn't shouting, crying, or begging, the three standard reactions of someone sitting in handcuffs. "Mom." Sergeant Hayes said, his tone neutral. "Do you have a name?" Sarah looked at the sergeant. The game of chicken was officially over. It was time to introduce herself. "My name is Sarah Jenkins," she said, her voice echoing clearly across the booking room. "I am a senior civil rights litigator for the United States Department of Justice. My federal identification and badge are in my wallet inside my vehicle, which your officers illegally abandoned at my home. And Sergeant, you have about 30 seconds to take these handcuffs off me before I personally ensure this precinct is subjected to a federal civil rights audit." The typing in the room suddenly stopped. Sergeant Hayes froze his pen, hovering over the booking sheet. Officer Barrett's proud smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The silence in the booking area was deafening. The rhythmic clacking of keyboards ceased entirely. A young desk officer holding a stack of file folders froze mid-step. The only sound left in the room was the low, electric hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. Sergeant Richard Hayes stared at the woman in the faded Georgetown law hoodie. He had been a cop for over 2 decades. He had a sixth sense for bluffers, sovereign citizens, and people trying to talk their way out of a holding cell. The woman standing before him, radiating an icy, unflinching authority, was not bluffing. "Barrett," Sergeant Hayes said, his voice dropping an octave, losing all of its previous boredom. "Take the cuffs off. Now." Officer Barrett blinked his face, flushing with a mix of confusion and stubborn pride. "Sarge, come on. She's lying. She's just a squatter who knows some legal jargon. She refused a lawful order. I said, take the cuffs off her, Barrett." Hayes barked, standing up from his desk. His chair rolled backward, slamming into a filing cabinet. "Do it before I strip you of your badge right here in the lobby." Officer Miller, who had been lingering near the doorway, practically sprinted over, pushing Barrett aside. Miller fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking visibly. "I'm sorry, Mom," Miller whispered as he unlocked the steel bracelets. "I told him we should just talk to you." The cuffs fell away with a heavy clatter. Sarah brought her arms forward, slowly, rubbing her wrists where the metal had pressed into her skin. She didn't look at Miller. She kept her eyes locked on Sergeant Hayes. "Sergeant, I want my keys," Sarah said, holding out her hand. Hayes glared at Barrett, who slowly reached into his pocket and placed the car keys onto the booking counter. "Officer Miller," Sarah continued, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "You are going to drive back to my property. You will unlock my vehicle, retrieve my black leather tote bag from the passenger seat, and bring it directly back to me. If my neighbor Brenda Carmichael is still standing on the sidewalk, you will inform her that she has filed a false police report and that she will be hearing from my legal counsel." Miller looked to his sergeant for approval. Hayes gave a sharp, frantic nod. "Go. Take the cruiser. Use the lights." As Miller bolted out the double doors, Sergeant Hayes hurried around the counter. He gestured nervously toward a glass-walled conference room down the hall. "Miss Jenkins, please, let's step into my office. I'll get you some water, some coffee. Let's sit down and figure this out." "I am not going anywhere with you, Sergeant," Sarah replied, standing her ground in the center of the booking area. "I am waiting right here in the lobby until my federal credentials arrive. Then I am calling your precinct captain, and then I am calling the Inspector General." Barrett, unable to read the room or control his bruised ego, crossed his arms. "You can call whoever you want. You still broke the law. You were obstructing." "Officer Barrett," Sarah said, turning her piercing gaze onto him. It was the same look she used to dismantle hostile witnesses in federal court. "Under the Virginia Code, obstruction of justice requires force, threats, or a physical attempt to impede an officer. Refusing to identify oneself does not constitute obstruction unless an actual arrest has been made for a separate crime. Furthermore, under the Fourth Amendment, you lacked reasonable suspicion to detain me." She stepped closer to him. Barrett instinctively took a half step back. "You didn't arrest me because I broke the law," Sarah continued, her voice perfectly level but sharp as glass. "You arrested me because I bruised your ego. You weaponized your badge to punish a black woman who dared to tell you no on her own property." 10 minutes later, the precinct doors flew open. Officer Miller rushed in, breathless, clutching a sleek black leather tote bag. He practically handed it to Sarah like an offering. Sarah unzipped the bag. She pulled out a slim navy blue leather wallet and flipped it open. A heavy gold enameled badge caught the fluorescent light, resting perfectly next to her Department of Justice identification card. It clearly read, "Sarah Jenkins, Senior Litigator, Civil Rights Division. Sergeant Hayes closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering exhale. He knew exactly what the Civil Rights Division did. They were the people who put rogue cops in federal prison. "Miss Jenkins," a new, breathless voice called out from the hallway. Captain Robert Donovan, the precinct commander, hurried into the lobby. He had clearly been pulled out of a meeting. His tie was askew and a sheen of sweat coated his forehead. Sergeant Hayes had managed to send a panic text to the brass while Miller was retrieving the bag. "Miss Jenkins, I'm Captain Donovan," he said, extending a hand that Sarah pointedly ignored. He quickly lowered it. "I cannot express how profoundly sorry I am for this misunderstanding. This is a complete failure of protocol. You are completely free to go. All charges are dropped, and the arrest record will be expuned immediately." "It's not a misunderstanding, Captain," Sarah corrected him. "A misunderstanding is getting an address wrong. Handcuffing a citizen without probable cause, initiating a false arrest, and violating their civil rights is a crime. And you cannot just expunge an unconstitutional arrest to make it go away." "Miss Jenkins, please," Donovan pleaded, lowering his voice in a desperate attempt at damage control. "Officer Barrett is a young cop. He made a tactical error. We will handle this internally. I assure you he will face disciplinary action, but let's not blow this out of proportion. You know how the media gets with these things." Sarah looked at the captain, then at Sergeant Hayes, and finally at Officer Barrett, who was now pale, finally grasping the magnitude of the career-ending crater he had just stepped into. "I am a federal prosecutor, Captain," Sarah said smoothly, slinging her tote bag over her shoulder. "My entire career is built on blowing unconstitutional police conduct completely out of proportion. I strongly suggest you retain municipal counsel. Have a pleasant afternoon." Without waiting for a response, Sarah turned on her heel and walked out of the precinct, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind her. The fallout was not immediate. It was surgical, methodical, and devastating. Sarah didn't go to the media. She didn't post a viral video or rant on social media. She went back to her beautiful new house, poured herself a glass of Cabernet, and booted up her encrypted DOJ laptop. The next morning, the Alexandria Police Department received a preservation order from the United States Department of Justice, legally mandating the immediate securing of all body-worn camera footage, dispatch logs, and internal communications related to her arrest. 2 days later, Sarah filed a massive civil lawsuit against Officer Thomas Barrett, the Alexandria Police Department, and the city of Alexandria. She alleged false arrest, excessive force, and a deprivation of her civil rights under 18 U.S.C. Section 242. But Sarah didn't stop there. Because she was the plaintiff, she couldn't prosecute the criminal case herself. However, her colleagues in the Civil Rights Division were more than happy to take the reins. A federal probe was launched into the precinct. When the FBI began digging into Officer Barrett's personnel file, they uncovered a horrifying yet entirely unsurprising pattern. Barrett had 11 prior complaints filed against him by minority residents in Oak Brook Estates and surrounding affluent neighborhoods. The complaints were nearly identical: detaining individuals without cause, aggressive posturing, and initiating arrests for disorderly conduct when citizens legally questioned his authority. Every single complaint had been buried by Sergeant Hayes and Captain Donovan under the guise of internal discipline. 3 months later, Sarah sat in a pristine, oak-paneled conference room in downtown D.C. for the civil depositions. Across the long table sat Officer Thomas Barrett. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He wore an ill-fitting gray suit and he looked exhausted. Beside him sat the city's defense attorney, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Officer Barrett," Sarah's private attorney began sliding a printed transcript across the table. "On the day of the incident, you stated, 'These people think they can read one article online and suddenly they're legal scholars.' To whom were you referring when you said 'these people'?" Barrett shifted in his seat, wiping his sweaty palms on his slacks. I just meant citizens, people who don't know police work. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked onto his. Did you mean black citizens? Officer Barrett, her attorney, pressed. The same demographic represented in 100% of your excessive force complaints. Objection, badgering, the city's lawyer mumbled weakly. Barrett swallowed hard. No, I didn't mean that, Officer Barrett. Sarah spoke up, her voice slicing through the tension in the room. When you told me that I was going to need an attorney, did it occur to you that perhaps you should have reviewed the basic tenets of the Fourth Amendment before putting your hands on someone who lives and breathes it? Barrett couldn't hold her gaze. He looked down at his hands. I was just responding to a dispatch, he whispered. You were responding to your ego, Sarah corrected quietly. The city settled the civil lawsuit 3 weeks later for an undisclosed 7-figure sum, which Sarah promptly donated to a legal defense fund for marginalized youth in Virginia. As part of the settlement, Officer Thomas Barrett was forced to resign and surrender his law enforcement certification permanently. He would never wear a badge again. Captain Donovan was forced into early retirement, and the entire Alexandria Police Department was placed under a federal consent decree mandating sweeping reforms, implicit bias training, and independent oversight regarding their stop and identify procedures. And then there was Brenda Carmichael. Sarah hadn't forgotten the neighborhood watch captain. While she couldn't throw Brenda in jail, she could certainly hold her accountable. Sarah filed a civil tort against Brenda for intentional infliction of emotional distress and filing a false police report. When the process server handed the lawsuit to Brenda on her front porch, the older woman burst into tears. She eventually settled out of court, paying a hefty sum and, more importantly, issuing a forced public apology in the local community newsletter. Admitting she had weaponized the police out of prejudice, Brenda moved out of Oakbrook Estates 6 months later, unable to face the neighborhood whispers. A year after the incident, it was another quiet Sunday afternoon in Alexandria. Sarah Jenkins stood on her newly renovated, magnificent wraparound porch. She wore a comfortable sweater and held a steaming mug of black coffee. The neighborhood was peaceful. The oak trees were beginning to shed their golden leaves. A sleek police cruiser slowly drove down the street on routine patrol. As it approached Sarah's house, the driver, a newly trained officer who had just completed the department's mandated constitutional law seminar, slowed down. He rolled down his window and offered a polite, respectful wave. Sarah took a sip of her coffee and waved back. Justice wasn't just something she argued for in federal court anymore. It was something she had built right here in her own front yard. What a massive reality check. It just goes to show that you never truly know who you're dealing with, and abusing your power can come back to destroy your career in the blink of an eye. What did you think of Sarah's master-ass in keeping calm under pressure? Let us know in the comments below. If you loved this story, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more real-life drama and insane plot twists.